Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Doug Bruggeman. I'm the founder of Ecological Services and Markets, and we've been hosting this conversation on species credits now for several months, and as a way to provide an opportunity to talk about the barriers and opportunities in species credit markets. And so obviously we're all very passionate about the topic and finding ways to improve these markets. We're excited about future regulation coming down from Fish and Wildlife Service, or guidance, I should say, on species mitigation. And this has been a great vehicle to pull ideas together from across the community and find opportunities for expanding species crediting to hopefully stave off the extinction of biodiversity and improve economic development across the U.S. I want to thank the steering committee, Greg DeYoung, Sarah Johnson, Donna Collier, and Craig Denisoff for helping me out and keeping this going. And we are going to have a session at the National Mitigation Environmental Banking Conference, a discussion. And so I'm hoping that you might join us in the discussion to help us expand and improve the webinar. We've had a good mix of regulators and investors and consultants coming together to discuss these topics. And even had one really great presentation from the Fish and Wildlife Service. We've had one state agency present, and so just want to create an open dialogue for improving species crediting. So today, excited as always to welcome the discussion on joint authority banking. So we had a great talk on this last month, and now we're going to go into part two. It's kind of like a Fast and Furious kind of series that we're doing here. So there's a lot to this topic, as you guys know. And so we're going to dive in deeper today with Rob Capriola. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Rob. Steve Martin, Ken Sanchez, and Sarah Johnson. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to jump in. Thank you so much. Oh, Sarah, one second though. Sorry. I do want to ask you guys to get ready for discussion and to pose questions in the chat box and to pose questions marked to everybody. And then we'll get to those questions and then perhaps even engage in an organic discussion, and you can unmute your mic. Sorry, Sarah. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah. And thank you, Doug, for continuing to host this. I think we're coming up maybe on 1 year of conversations on species credits as a forum. And I think it's just been a really helpful effort to have underway. So thank you. So I'm just going to offer a brief overview, and then we'll dive in with our main speakers. This is a continuation, as Doug said, of the important topic of joint banking. We thought that there was a relevant nexus for conservation and species banks, considering that oftentimes right now conservation banks are set up as a joint bank along with 404. And so thinking about the processes there and challenges and opportunities for improvement, there's a lot of interest from the industry in being able to do more joint banks, certainly seeing the benefits it could offer from an ecological standpoint, as well as being able to diversify credit type and have more demand drivers for a single bank site investment. But there's a lot of challenges. And so we're going to get into some of the specific challenges and how those have been dealt with and overcome through some case studies today. In part one, we took a really high level overview. We looked at authority undermining for joint banks. We also did a compare and contrast between 404 mitigation banks and conservation banks. We looked at the typical process and agency coordination best practices. And now today we're taking a deeper dive on those lessons learned by walking through a couple of specific case studies. Really grateful to have the practitioners that we do with us today who have spent time working shoulder to shoulder with the agencies to try to be innovative and find a path forward for joint banks, and appreciate Rob, Ken, and Steve, you guys sharing that expertise. So with that, let me turn it first to Rob to introduce himself, and then Ken, and then we'll go to Steve and kick off on slide 2 once we get to Steve. Oh, Rob, I think you're on mute.
Trying to be a good citizen, yeah. Again, with Westervelt Ecological Services, I've been involved as a project manager for 3 joint banks here in California. So that's my experience I bring to it.
Perfect, great. Thanks, Rob and Ken.
I'm Ken Sanchez. I work for RES. We're a mitigation solutions provider. Prior to that, I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 23 years in Sacramento, working on banks with Rob and Steve. And prior to that, I'm California born and bred, and I'm also, my third hat is I'm on the board of directors for the Center for Natural Lands Management, which is a land trust that takes on primarily a majority of our lands are mitigation lands. Thanks, Sarah.
Great, thanks, Ken. And I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm Sarah Johnson, Executive Director of URBA Trade Association, focused on mitigation and ecological restoration policies. I'm mainly here just to help in a facilitator role, and I'll talk a little bit about some policy recommendations at the end, but Rob, Ken, and Steve are the stars here. With that, Steve, I'll turn it to you for a bio, and we can jump to slide 2.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I'm Steve Martin. I'm an independent contractor mitigation specialist. Currently, I'm providing technical and policy support to a number of nonprofit and for-profit entities. In 2020, I retired from the Corps of Engineers. While I was at the Corps, I was providing mitigation policy and practical support to Corps headquarters and to a number of districts around the country. As Doug had indicated, this is a follow-on to last month's conversation. What we're going to focus on are those important coordination areas associated with the development and operation of joint authority, or sometimes they're called multiple purpose banks. We'll talk about resource location and crediting with a lot of examples. This concept of credit stacking, bundling, or grouping, and double dipping, and then talk about some practices that can facilitate the development of joint banking. Next slide, please. So what drives the joint banking market is really where you have resources that 2 or more regulatory agencies have authority over. Examples would include things like vernal pools, where you have a wetland, a vernal pool, but the wetland also supports at-risk species, such as vernal pool aquatic invertebrates, or perhaps listed amphibians. But it extends to other resources like riverine systems that also support at-risk salmonids. It might be something like intertidal vegetated wetlands that are regulated independently by multiple regulatory authorities, such as a federal agency like the Corps of Engineers, maybe a state agency, and perhaps even local government. Next slide. There's a number of potential pitfalls. We talked about this a little bit last month, the fact that you're dealing with different authorizing agencies. They have different regulatory authorities. Their focuses are typically different. Those agencies responsible for the Endangered Species Act are likely to look at resources differently from the Corps of Engineers that's looking at Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, or perhaps a state agency that is looking at resources from the standpoint of Section 402 of the Clean Water Act, pollution. What this means, because you're dealing with different resources, you have different credit types. Think of them as different currencies, and that means different crediting methods. So communication among the regulatory agencies, let's call them the chairs, is critical to ensure that there aren't conflicting directives for bank establishment, operation, and use, because each of those agencies may very well have different goals, look at different performance standards, different credit release schedules, financial assurances, and so on. Next slide, please. So here are some critical areas for agency coordination. I'll just give you some examples. For example, a site that's designed for restoration of, say, seasonal wetlands, something that I've worked with quite a bit, may not be optimal for salmonids or may not provide the most limiting habitat for those salmonids, such as habitat for juvenile or outmigrating smolts. Determining what a credit is and whether the same credit can be used as an offset under multiple authorities is very important. Likewise, the assessment method used is especially important. So the Corps might look at a credit in terms of credit acres or something equivalent, while another agency like NOAA Fisheries might consider application of another assessment methodology, such as HEA, evaluating credit requirements in terms of a different metric like DSAs. What this means then is that if you have multiple credit types, these joint authority credits can complicate ledgers. Tools like rivets might be used to facilitate tracking and ensure that credits are not used more than once, but this is something that needs to be thought about during the development of the bank and the bank instrument. We often see different service areas for different resource types. In some cases, we've seen different service areas for the same resource that is regulated under different authorities. So this is one of those important areas for agency coordination. And at this point, I'm going to hand it off to my successor.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples here. We're not going to be able to cover all of the complexities of it, but just give you a little flavor of it. So this is a picture of the Kimball Island Mitigation Bank. It's in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. I know, Greg, Dan, I think you were involved in this. It's a mixture of wetland credit, it's got stream credit, and it has species credits. And multiple agencies were involved. I think 4 federal agencies and 2 state agencies were involved. The credit ledger was quite complex, but and singling the credits out, but that was important so that it was clear again that there wasn't any double take. You'll hear this again and again in this presentation of credits being applied to permits. Go ahead, Doug. Next slide, please. This is going to be just to show you how wild the service areas can get. This is our Bullock Bend, Westervelt's Bullock Bend Mitigation Bank. It's on the main stem of the Sacramento River, which has really had a lot of the riparian habitat wiped out, and it has a big run of salmon and steelhead. Next slide, please. So the conceptual plan is on the right. The different colors represent different credit types. Now you'll see on the credit table, there are seven different credits. And under the columns of approving agencies, some of them have the same, but some of them have different authorities for approval. So this was a credit ledger that got complicated real quickly. But you see that here there are 3 approving agencies. Of course, the EPA was also part of this bank. I'm not sure why they weren't listed here. Next slide, please. Again, the 404 is on the left. That was based on HUCs and truncated by ecoregion boundary. So that was our 404 core authority, EPA, and then the salmonids, they're based on something called an evolutionarily significant unit or a recovery area in a recovery plan. And even between the 2 different runs of salmon, they have slightly different service areas. Now, lastly, on the right is service area for Swainson's hawk, which is state listed only, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And there are no fewer than 5 different criteria that were negotiated to meet this service area. So these represent a lot of time and effort to negotiate each and every one of them. So every single agency or authority that you add, I believe it multiplies the effort exponentially, not linearly. Okay, next slide, please. All right, I think this is, I'm going to hand it over to Ken, and then we're going to tag team on this idea of co-located or separately located resources on banks.
Thanks, Rob. That's a great example. There's two important things that bank sponsors want to know. What Rob was just talking about a bit is service areas, and then of course credits. We want to know, and I'll say we with my mitigation provider hat on, we want to know what's our service area and how many credits do we get, and for what species, and of course a credit release schedule. My sort of early philosophies, and my philosophy still is, I mean, the biggest service area possible is going to incentivize people to come into the market. And as a regulator, I wanted, more people in the market, but you have to consider things like genetics and stuff like that. So for credits, the first example we'll talk about is one of the most rewarding projects I worked on with Westervelt as a regulator. And here I am as Rez. I know my boss is listening. I was just very proud of the work that we did with Westervelt at this time. It was a very unique property, 150-acre parcel of irrigated ag land in the southern San Joaquin Valley, which is pretty much a desert for most species and wetlands. It's all been converted 1800s and 1900s. The sponsor was Department of Water Resources, a state water provider. They went and purchased land and needed some advanced credits for projects they were going to be working on their levees and so forth. And so, the for-profit Westervelt stepped in and had a partnership, and I think it worked out pretty well. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm not telling you to advance slides. One more slide. Thanks, Doug. So this is the bank. The property built two kinds of wetlands. One was a managed marsh, which is an actively managed, water is provided either from ag tailwater or wells. And then the other is a passively managed wetland, seasonal wetlands, 404 credits in the passive side, and giant garter snake, which is a state and federally listed species on the managed water side. Next slide, please. Let's see. So here's an image of the bank and an image of the giant garter snake, is a subspecies of snake in the southern, ranged pretty well from north of Sacramento all the way down to Bakersfield historically. Unique about what I was really interested in here is the snake. When I was a regulator, the snake was gone from about 66% of its range. All that southern San Joaquin range was, drained and turned into a vegetable basket for California, for the nation actually. And so there was really one holdout snake population just to the left of this picture, or to the west, is Volta State Refuge, California Department of Fish and Wildlife Refuge, where snakes have been hanging on. And so the piece of property just to the east of it, the property you're looking at, seemed to be an ideal spot to restore, create historic wetland complexes. And with a supply of water from the wells, you can see the wells marked there. And the key will show you that they built some wetlands that satisfied 404, 401 credits, state credits, state and federal wetland impacts, as well as the state and federal snake credits with the darker green. So anyway, I think that's my last slide, and we move on to.
Yeah, I'll pick this up. Yeah. So that was a great example of where the two credit types are on the same bank. It's still in the joint bank, but they're physically separated. This is an example of where they're overlapping resources with an extra nuance. So we have in California here, we have these crazy things called vernal pools. I know you have in other parts of the world, but they're pretty prominent in the Central Valley here. And they're assumed to have fairy or tadpole shrimp, one or the other in them, which are federally listed. So here's a injured comes in and is gonna cover it all over with vineyards, drain it, and needs to mitigate for it. So next slide, please. So there's lots of ways to manipulate the earth to create vernal pools. They're rainfall driven. Got to have the right soils though, and we like to do that in a landscape that has some existing vernal pools. And so these banks, you restore the hydrology by excavating. You have essentially a 404 Waters of the U.S. credit along with the species creation credits. And then additionally, the Fish and Wildlife Service has been requiring permittees to essentially expand the footprint of what's required to a landscape scale by having them require vernal pool preservation credits. So we can get all of those needs satisfied for permittee on a piece of vernal pool ground by establishing some additional creation credits there. So next slide, please. This is just more of an easy to understand graphic illustration. This is from a grading plan for the Meridian Ranch Mitigation Bank, which is my first project with Westervelt. So the dark colors are either rehabilitation, reestablishment, or creation polygons. And the light, and so those would have both 404 and ESA creation credits, species credits. The light color is the delineation, would be preservation credits, and those would only be the authority for ESA. And the crediting was very complicated. The Corps and the service didn't agree on the crediting for the created wetlands, but magically the two seemed to align in the end. We were very close, so we just picked the lower number of credits out of those calculations. So hopefully this graphic gives you a picture where those are co-located species and wetland credits, the dark colors. That's all I have, I think.
I'm gonna, this is Ken, I'm gonna introduce Steve for the next couple slides. I would like to make a couple comments here. A deeper dive into crediting nomenclature and practices. I would just say that Rob said this is hard. I'm not, or complicated. I'm not sure that it's complicated so much as it's hard. It's really hard. And I'm going to speak to the regulators here. Any individual regulator or, can sit down and go, yeah, I'll give you 20 snake credits, 20 acres of snake credits, or, wetland credits, or whatever it is. But the hard part is for the agencies to, work amongst themselves and find a way to provide a synchronicity or a synergy between them, and allow a piece of ground to realize the most conservation value that it can. And some of the challenges there are, I would observe when I first walked into this, I started looking at the biological opinions that we were writing and noticing that we use different terminology than was being developed for banking crediting methodologies. And the same with wetlands. It comes down to classification, terminology, the way that a different, biologist or wetlands ecologist sees the world. So I think working together, a lack of consistent terminology, synchronizing terminology is going to be important. And Steve's going to talk a little bit about unbundling, unstacking, double dipping, and all of those other things that people love to stress over. Next slide, please.
Okay, so what you see there is a citation from the core EPA 2008 mitigation rule, and it indicates quite clearly that under no circumstances can the same credit be used to provide mitigation for more than one permitted activity. In other words, no double dipping. Next slide. Ken did a really good job of introducing this issue of terminology and confusing terminology. In one part of the country, a practice is referred to as credit stacking. In another part of the country, the same practice is known as credit bundling. With rivets, we tried to sidestep bundling and stacking by referring to it as credit grouping. At its heart, it's all relatively simple. Under this idea of bundling or stacking or grouping, the credit represents spatially overlapping ecosystem functions and services. It's traded as a single commodity. So if we look at the vernal pool that Rob talked about, the vernal pool could be considered a credit. Restoration or establishment of a vernal pool is a credit that has two attributes. One attribute is the 404 attribute, the wetland attribute. The other is the listed species attribute. When the credit is debited for an impact, both those attributes are retired, whether they're necessary for a given authorization or not. It's a single commodity. And the 2008 mitigation rule indicates that this is okay. The idea of credit unbundling or unstacking is the idea that this set of spatially overlapping ecosystem functions or services can be parsed, unbundled, or unstacked, and each function or service can be traded as a separate commodity and compensates for different permitted impacts. And this is a problem. This is inconsistent with the core EPA 2008 mitigation rule. Basically, what you're doing by unstacking or unbundling, you're setting up a situation where this joint authority bank is actually contributing to a loss of ecosystem functions or services. Double dipping is related to it. It's the idea of selling the same ecosystem function or service credit, however you define it, multiple times, and that's not allowed. In the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, there's a reference. I can share the reference with Doug. He can make it available to you. It's a very good paper that was written by Morgan Robertson and others back in 2014 that examines these terms, these concepts a little more fully. Next slide. So just to beat this horse a little further, where credits for multiple resources, whether we're talking several different species or species and 404 wetlands or wetlands and offsets of phosphorus or nitrogen, when they occupy the same acre, you'd consider them bundled or stacked. And those credits can't be sold for different impacts associated with different projects. They can't be unbundled or unstacked. By doing so, we could see a loss of aquatic resource functions. Again, reiterating the point from the 2008 mitigation rule, the same credit can't be used for more than one permitted activity. And I'm going to hand it off now.
So looking at going back to sort of the bigger picture, the overriding considerations to facilitate the things that we've talked about here, you know, I'm very California centric, but I think that we've done some things together with the agencies that have helped us have a track, you know, a track to a conclusion and a track to success, a successful bank approvals. In California, we have an MOU, we have an organizational structure of elevating issues and elevating policies so that, you know, staff who are busily working on these can resolve difficult questions and difficult policy issues where either statutes or regulations don't integrate nicely. And we develop those practices. I think the templates have helped us a lot. We have templates for bank enabling instruments. We have templates for management plans. We have templates for conservation easements, and those things have made it easy with the lawyers a little bit and easy with staff sort of all of our staffs trying to manage language and terminology in what are complicated legal documents at some level. Next slide, please. Future of joint banking, I think working together, integrating policies and regulations that weren't developed together are going to be important for all of us to do. Streamlining other regulatory processes. I would note in California, the state legislature, the governor signed and approved an exemption under one of the state environmental laws for restoration projects, an exemption for restoration projects under CEQA. That was an important advance. I think that it doesn't exempt it from the ESA laws or the wetlands laws or any of the other ones, but it certainly recognizes that restoration is at scale is going to be an important tool for us all to rely upon when looking at sea level rise and all of the other things that face us. So next slide, please. And that's Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Steve, Ken, and Rob. Really helpful to walk through some of those specific issues and the case studies. We wanted to take a slide to just wrap up and take everything we've been talking about and think about how it translates to the immediate policy opportunity that we have as the service is working on reissuing, hopefully seeing soon reissuance of service-wide mitigation policies and an ESA compensatory mitigation policy, and then also, of course, the forthcoming species mitigation rule. Within IRBA, we've had a committee that's now been formed and underway, was even meeting on a weekly basis for a time period for 11 months now. And they've really been looking at some specific recommendations on how to align the process and the terminology that we see in the 404 space and was set in the 2008 rule, and how we bring that into now the forthcoming species rule, making sure that those processes are parallel so that we really can continue to encourage joint banks. We've also thought about what are the lessons learned from the 08 rule and implementation of the 404 program, and lessons learned, as we just heard, from some of these existing joint banking examples. So I'll touch on, you can see them here on the bullets, but so one of the top recommendations we've made is trying to align the same instrument requirements that you see enumerated in the 08 rule, also seeing those put into the rule text for the forthcoming species rule. And the service already did a lot of great work on outlining instrument provisions and the meaning and definition of each of those provisions in their draft 2017 implementation guidance. So we've encouraged, hope to see that in forthcoming guidance and the rule. We also talked about, just again, aligning those timelines where it says 30 days in the 08 rule, seeing 30 days also for a response from the service in the forthcoming rule, wanting to have the same timelines to facilitate better predictability and not having confusion between regulators or agencies on tracking dual processes and timelines. We did, though, identify some opportunities to deviate from the 08 rule and learn on that, such as stipulating specific gaps in timelines that currently exist, trying to reinforce responses to things like credit release requests, trying to add some boundaries around when an extension may or may not be granted for agency review, or because a sponsor hasn't gotten feedback, answered questions back yet. We also are thinking about ways, and this is difficult because you don't want all of this in a rule, but thinking about ways maybe in guidance to incorporate certain proven project management and tracking tools. And if we can get ahead of that at the outset, as the service sets this rule, will we all be on the same page for sponsors and regulators using those best practices and project management tools early on, rather than later trying to cycle those in as we're seeing in the 404 context. We've also been talking about, beyond just these process elements, some of the specific substantive, kind of lessons learned from joint species banking. So we heard Ken highlighted, the challenge with the Westervelt's Grasslands Bank and wanting to have flexibility on the part of regulators to maybe go outside of a prescribed service area or broaden the service area to really identify for this particular species, where is the location of a mitigation site that will produce the highest and best ecological value for that species. And maybe that requires some flexibility then in service area to achieve that. So that's something that we've been thinking about. Let me pause there, and I think we've got one more slide here that just reminds Doug, if you want to click through. I think we've just got one more slide here that hammers home the biggest issue that we hear about with joint banking, no double dipping. But I think with those policy ideas and with the case studies, we probably now can jump into some Q&A.
Great. Thank you guys so much for that very thorough presentation. And I love that picture. It's really not inviting. It's perfect. So we don't have any questions right now in the Q&A. I'm going to take the host prerogative and ask a question. So I'm curious with the joint banks, has there ever been a situation in which, well, let's say, on a wetland bank, where you start a wetland bank and then endangered species show up? So it's not set up as a joint bank, yet it provides a environmental benefit. For example, with hydrological connectivity is important for you guys, and that could lead to migration of species. Has anybody seen that in their banking?
Oh, Lord have mercy. Yes. And I do see a hand up there, Doug, when I'm finished ranting here. Doug Lashley has his hand up. So I wouldn't say it's an example of a species showing up, but for some California tiger salamander banks in California, the species was listed subsequent to the federal listing. We did some banks, and now we're going back and seeking state approval of the banks. So it's basically just going back and getting a reapproval or an amendment, or in some cases, because there are new templates and there are new new templates for the BEI and new templates for the conservation easement, that it's essentially doing a new bank, with, it's fine. We understand the progress that we've made with our instruments and easements, and but it's really from the banker's perspective, it's really a resource. It's a staffing issue with the agencies. It's tough to it's tough to keep these things moving because there's a lot of stuff going on.
Great. Yeah, that's neat to hear. And so, Doug, do you want to jump in?
If you're referring to Doug Lashley, yeah, I had a hand up. I joined a little late, but did I understand correctly that in California there are in existence multiple credit banks that involve both water quality and species or some other eco asset credit value?
Yeah, a number of them. Yeah.
We only at Greenvest, we only do work on the East Coast. And there's only one state where riparian buffer credits are allowed to be used on the same bank site as wetland credits. What is the authority? Is it guidance? Is it rule and regulation, or is it law that allows a multi-credit bank in California?
Doug, maybe you can go to the previous slide that has the credit table.
And Steve, I don't know if you want to speak on the authority part. It's in the rule that this is an option, but it's facilitated in California because of the investment that the different agencies have put towards developing templates. Steve or Rob, yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Sure. In terms of the regs, the 2008 mitigation rule does allow for a mitigation project to provide offsets under different authorities, so long as that same credit is not used for different purposes, different projects. And so it's the idea that if a credit has multiple attributes, if it's used to offset, say, Section 404, the credit's retired. The ESA component is retired with it as well. In the East Coast, there's a couple of banks in Virginia that have authorization to sell wetland credits, certain subset of wetland credits as water quality offsets, basically as offsets pounds of phosphorus. And the banker is allowed to do so with the understanding once the credit is debited for those pounds of phosphorus, the credit's gone. It can't, those attributes can't be parsed and traded separately. It's part and parcel of the overall credit. Rob, do you want to add something?
All right, so Steve, I was going to say the second part of the question is, if, let's say you debit the 404 wetland credit, if it's a 1,000 acre restored forested wetland system, do you think that precludes the ability to go back and amend the instruments to allow for carbon mitigation?
For the undebited portion, I would think it would be allowable. For the debited portion, no. And the regs are very clear that credit value doesn't change once it's been debited. But for any undebited or residual credits, that certainly would be a possibility. Having said so, the regulations are also very clear that adding a new credit type triggers a modification of the instrument. So arguably then it would go through the public notice and coordination process.
You know, there's some of us in the industry, and I'd be interested in some feedback from everybody. And Sarah, maybe this can be the subject of a future discussion, but obviously climate change and global warming and carbon, the need to reduce the carbon footprint is growing significantly. And if the 404 wetland credit is a water quality based issue, and the systems that we're putting in the ground today with permanent conservation easements result in a forest 20 years from now,
Right.
Taking up significant carbon, whether it's a modification, Steve, to the existing instrument or a new instrument under whatever protocol is adopted for carbon offsets, I just think it's something that the industry should keep an eye on, because it's not contemplated, at least as long as I've been in banking, that a 404 mitigation was going to have a positive carbon uptake. I'd be less than frank if I didn't say in some case we've argued for a different credit ratio associated with certain values that you can't get separate credit for, but we never argued about the carbon uptake.
Mm-hmm.
I can certainly see what you're saying, Doug. Most of my banking experience has been in the Dismal Swamp. We're dealing with histosols, organic soils, or soils with histic epipedans, large amount of organic matter.
Right.
A lot of these are forested wetlands. They are very important in terms of carbon sequestration. In fact, it's one of the important functions that these resources provide. In approving the bank, the chair and the IRT members should be taking into account the full suite of services that are being provided. We actually have had a number of bankers before talk about selling wetland credits for carbon offsets, and there was no objection to it. But parsing that particular function out, when that is one of the things that that particular restored wetland system does starts us down the track of potentially contributing to a net loss of aquatic resource functions. Having said that, I have no problem with going back in and reevaluating credit assessment for those undebited credits.
Mhm.
Again, I can't see selling the same credit twice, once for 404 wetlands and then later on as a carbon offset. But those undebited credits, I can think of them as having multiple attributes, and that credit could be sold for any of those different attributes, so long as once it's debited, it's retired.
And Steve
Okay.
hit on Steve hit on the right terminology again, undebited. You know, 1,000 acre of forested wetland is 1,000 acres. You sell them all out, you're sold out, the bank is closed, you turn it over to long-term management. But in 20 or 30 years, we may know more about carbon sequestration, and the people regulating carbon sequestration may want to come in and look at that piece of property and say, well, we can give you some credit because it's doing something. There's some lift. You know, I would imagine that there's a lot of regulators right now going, well, wait a minute, that's double dipping. Well, and it may be, but I think that people need to look at these pieces of property at the value that they're providing. And, you know, is there something, I mean, as a brand, I don't want to be seen as a double dipper. We're not, you know, we're there to sell wetland credits, and we're there to sell out and put it into long-term perpetual management. But I think in 100 years or 20 years, when these are the only things left out there, people are going to look at them a little bit differently.
Mhm.
Well, this is really great discussion, and
Okay.
we had another comment from Thea Rose. And I think we answered her question, but I want to give her a chance to speak up if she wants. Thea?
Yes, hello. I do feel like I got a good answer just from the natural motion of that conversation. I kind of did have a follow-up question. Just I'm pretty new to mitigation banking in general, so this is all interesting and different for me. But if an undebited credit, so I'm just trying to connect, I guess, the double dipping issue versus the joint banking phenomenon or template, whatever you want to call it, connect that in a way. And so if an undebited credit, can an undebited credit be used like at a joint bank if it has multiple assets or resources or species? Is that kind of the connection, that if you have credits, undebited credits left over in your bank and it's a joint bank, meaning it may have a multiple resources, then you can use those credits as you want. And in that case, it wouldn't be double dipping because you use one credit for this and then you have an undebited credit for another species, then you're able to use that. And that's kind of a clarifying question, if I'm getting it correctly.
Yeah, I think you have it right. We were talking about if there's you want to add another resource to a bank, then maybe it's only a wetland bank, and then you find a species that's now nesting on the site that is listed, and so maybe you're halfway through your credit sales on the wetlands. Maybe it's 100 credits, and you've sold 50, and you want to add this species credits to the bank. You can only add the species to the remaining 50 credits of the bank.
Okay, yeah, that was a nice example.
Yeah, I agree with that, Rob. And again, you know, if there are unsold credits in a bank, they're unsold, whatever they are, they're a wetland, they're a serpentine soil, they're a plant credit, whatever the agency signed and approved, and those credits remain unsold in 10 years and something else of value can be placed on that, I think it's up to the regulator to make a decision of, well, this is a good spot for us to do our, you know, to direct our mitigation. we would amend the bank or somehow approve that sale or that exchange to occur and satisfy whatever regulation is in place at the time. And again, as a brand for Res, for Westerveld, I'll speak for them all, none of us want to be, we're not out there to resell these things after we've sold out, to retool them and resell them. You know, the impacts are to be directed to unsold credits or unsold values, if you will.
And just to add to that, speaking as a former regulator, I would certainly encourage those credits being used as offsets under multiple authorities. If it's a good site, then I want the mitigation provider, the banker, to be successful, because if the banker's successful, I know that that company is likely to reinvest in that geographic area and provide more good conservation projects.
Okay, great. We do have one more hand up I'd like to get to before we run out of time. We've got a hand from Marlene Tyner Valancourt. Marlene, would you like to unmute yourself and jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I wanted to circle back to the conversation we were having previously about carbon crediting in wetlands. And one of the things that I've been kind of stumped about is how you make the economics of it work, given that the cost of doing wetland restoration is so high, particularly in California, and the cost of carbon offsets on their own is so low, like the markets just don't really align. And obviously, I think that we all know that as climate change continues to progress and as our open spaces reduce in size across the landscape, hopefully carbon sequestration will become more valuable and the market value of those credits would align more. But I guess I would just be interested in hearing sort of everyone's thoughts on the panel about how you think about structuring your crediting at these banks so that if people who just need carbon offsets and don't need 404 mitigation can actually afford to come to your bank and pay for those.
One way, looking at another resource that had been done, I know that there's a couple of banks in my home state of Virginia where the interagency review team has approved use of a certain subset of credits. In this case, it's reforested uplands. They generated a very small amount of wetland credits. The state Department of Environmental Quality, based on a thorough evaluation, provided a conversion of those wetland credits to pounds of phosphorus removed. And so they were able to convert an acre of wetland credit or a wetland credit into pounds of phosphorus. They were able to make that work. Now, there was a regulatory driver. In the state, any development that impacts results in land clearing above a certain threshold has to provide those water quality offsets. And it can be calculated in terms of pounds of phosphorus that have to be secured. So there's a strong regulatory driver there. But the sponsor, the banker, has a choice. Do I sell those credits as wetland credits, or do I sell those credits as water quality offsets? And they evaluate the economics of it. In the case of these couple of banks, they determined it was more beneficial to sell those credits as phosphorus offsets than as wetland credits.
You know, Marlene, that's a good question, and I'm not into the economics of it. I've looked a little bit at the drivers, but tried to read the science behind restoring a native tallgrass prairie versus restoring a coastal tidal marsh and the returns that you get in carbon sequestration on it. I think we're just going to have to look bigger than just a California market, right? I mean, it's going to have to be almost international, and the economics, at scale restoration in Central America may be more economical and provide the same benefit than trying to do it in California, where, you know, an acre of coastal tidal marsh is probably $1 million or $2 million as mitigation. The costs.
Hey, Marlene, I think the example that Steve gave where you might have an upland buffer or part of the property that wouldn't be a species or wetland credits, the only real area, because I've looked at those numbers also, and just it's on a complete different scale of the pricing that we have now, what we're paying for land in here in California.
Yeah, that's I've been looking at stormwater crediting and at 404, 1600 banks, and have come to the same conclusion that you got to look at those kind of like those upland buffer areas that the agencies will give you credit for, but then they don't require anyone to mitigate when they impact those areas, so you can't actually sell those credits. So thank you, that was very interesting.
Well, everyone, thank you so much. This is a great discussion, and it's an important topic that hopefully we'll see more on. And definitely there's going to be at least one talk I know at the National Mitigation of Environmental Banking Conference on this. Just want to thank you guys for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you again. We are doing a discussion session on the webinar. If you'd like to come and add your ideas and participation, that'd be great. It'd be good to meet you. And at this point, I just want to kind of turn things over to Sarah, see if Sarah has any concluding remarks.
Great, thank you, Doug. No, I think really good. Appreciated the discussion, and like to appreciate Doug Lashley, you raising the carbon point, and Marlene, your follow-up. I'll just say we hear all the time there's a lot of interest from Congress to congressional offices in this blue carbon offset, and if we can find a way to make it work, there's definitely interest there. But as you pointed out, the economics haven't caught up. Either way, certainly a lot of interest and support for finding ways to really look at these sites for their maximum conservation value and find ways to make joint banking work. And so we're hoping to see it accelerated with this species mitigation rule that will have a lot of parallels with the 2008 rule. With that, I think I liked your Fast and Furious reference, Doug, at the beginning. I don't know if we're going to go to number 3 for joint banking. So this is just joint banking, the sequel, no further iterations. Really appreciate all the interest and folks who joined us today, and we'll look forward to seeing a lot of people at NMEBC in Boise.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.